Let
Uh,
me. Okay.
we really am sorry for the inconvenience, Dr. Moss.
Fine, it's fine. It's okay.
Okay, so could I repeat my first questions?
I think it's better. Yeah, go ahead and repeat your question because you're clearer now. I can hear you very clearly. So.
Okay, yeah. Let's go to the first question. Yeah, before we talk about the classical German philosophy, we always ask our interviewees in our hub about what philosophy is. So we want also to ask you what philosophy is for you and how could you be first introduced to philosophy. Also, why have you ever considered to indulge in academic philosophy?
Okay, thanks so much again for the invitation, and thank you for the question. So I suppose I'll begin by thinking about philosophy from the original Greek sense, which is the love of wisdom. But when we follow up with this basic definition of philosophy as love of wisdom, I think this can lead us to an understanding of philosophy which actually is very close to the way that the German idealists understood philosophy. So as a lover of wisdom, we're interested in discovering what makes wisdom wisdom. We're interested in what it is that all cases of wisdom have in common. So what's universal across every case of wisdom? So on the one hand, it seems like philosophy is interested in what is universal. But it's not just interested in what is universal. It's also, it seems, interested in what is unconditioned. Because we're not just interested in knowledge insofar as it's conditioned by other knowledge, but we're interested in knowledge that conditions all other knowledge, the knowledge upon which all knowledge depends. So it looks like philosophy, insofar as it's an inquiry into wisdom, is interested in what is universal and also what is unconditioned. And my term for universal and unconditioned knowledge is absolute, the absolute. So as I understand it, and for me in my practice, philosophy is all about thinking about absolute knowledge. And we can also construe that definition in terms of metaphysics too. We don't have to think about it merely in terms of epistemology. So knowledge is always about something that is. So we can think about absolute knowledge as having a being as its object. And if absolute knowledge is going to be absolute, it needs to be all-encompassing. The universal and the unconditioned, understood as absolute, really is a kind of all-encompassing knowledge. So we can think about absolute knowledge as an inquiry into the being of all beings, or what makes anything be what it is, right? So we could think about the love of wisdom, the inquiry into wisdom, as an inquiry into the universal and unconditioned knowledge, but we can also think of it as an inquiry into the universal and unconditioned being, right? What makes any being be what it is. And just to add one more thing, when we think about philosophy as an inquiry into what is universal and unconditioned, this ultimately leads us to think about philosophy as an inquiry into ourselves, so a self-inquiry. Because if I don't inquire into my own inquiring, then my inquiring is not absolute, it's not universal. So my own inquiry into knowledge has to involve, well, turning back to my own thinking about my own thinking. So this is, on the inscription at the temple at the Oracle of Delphi in Greece, we have this inscription, know yourself. So it seems to me that philosophy, because it's about what is universal and unconditioned, must also include itself in its inquiry. And I think that's the so-called critical side of philosophy. Maybe on a personal note, I don't know, how did I end up in philosophy? I grew up kind of like in a very religious family, very kind of dogmatic religious education. And I think I was turned on to philosophy through conversations with friends who challenged me to think differently. And some friends recommended really really excellent books, such as The Greek Way by Edith Hamilton, that really stimulated my interest in Greek thinking and challenged some of my more dogmatic attitudes. And so as my orientation to the world kind of fell apart, I had no better ideas about what to do with my life. So I thought philosophy may empower me to find a new orientation. And so I went to university and studied philosophy. And then I never recovered. I never did anything else. So I had some odd jobs, but more or less it's, once philosophy gripped hold of me, it wouldn't let go. So now I almost feel like it's not always a choice. I feel almost impelled to do it. Yeah. Well, so I hope that's some personal anecdotes and maybe something systematic in there too.
It's really clear. Can I first translate it to the audience?
Of course. Yeah, take your time.
Okay. Oke, teman-teman, ini menarik banget penjelasannya tadi ya. Ini nuansanya nuansa Jerman banget gitu ya. Yang namanya filsafat itu gunanya adalah untuk melakukan yang namanya inquiry atau penelitian, pencari tahuan akan yang universal, yang objektif gitu ya. Mungkin keindahan gitu ya, mungkin kebaikan dan semacamnya gitu ya. Jadi ini sama kayak di Yunani ya, love of wisdom, tapi secara khusus membicarakan soal yang universal gitu ya. Dan kenapa Dr. Moss ini bisa ketemu sama filsafat? Karena dia itu dari keluarga yang kayaknya religius gitu ya. Mungkin kayak dia dan gue sendiri juga dari keluarga religius. Gitu. Jadi ketika itu dia berbicara dengan banyak orang dan melihat bahwa ternyata filsafat itu membuatku mempertanyakan banyak hal dan juga pada saat yang sama membuatku untuk memiliki orientasi yang baru di dalam kehidupan. Oke, jadi itu kurang lebih. So, Dr. Moss, I have one question regarding your definition on philosophy. I think there are some philosophers who consider philosophy merely as a second-order inquiry. Maybe some analytic philosopher. What do you think of that kind of definitions? Philosophy as something that is a second-order inquiry.
Yeah, so could you say something more about what you mean by second order first, and maybe then I can follow up a bit.
Okay, maybe in the way that if I could say it, analytic philosophers does philosophy. Yeah, they do philosophy of science, they do philosophy of economics, and etc. etc. Maybe that's the concrete examples of thinking philosophy as a second order inquiry.
Right. So we can do philosophy of economics, philosophy of sport, philosophy of whatever. But then, of course, if we make a claim about what philosophy is, that it is second order, then, of course, it still has to be about itself, right? So no, as long as we're making a claim about what philosophy is, it's going to have this self-reflective character. And I suppose that one could still think of philosophy as, philosophy of economics, philosophy of sport, etc. But then one could ask about the philosophies that study all of these other philosophies. That still seems to be an open question to me, or it doesn't seem to close off the view that I'm proposing.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, it's not so much, I could say, different than what you offered. Yeah. Okay.
There may be a complementary understanding going on, but I suppose language like absolute is not very common. I think like this language of the absolute is really more endemic to 19th century thinking. But I certainly have this. It's alive in my own thought. So I'm trying to preserve it as a living philosophical term, although it isn't really, I don't think a very popular term in especially contemporary analytic philosophy. I don't think. Yeah.
So that's why it will be an interesting discussion. So why do you have an interest in classical German philosophy or German idealism? Jadi kenapa Dr. Moss punya ketertarikan sama idealisme Jerman? Okay.
Yeah. So for this question, I may also give a personal anecdote because I'm not exactly sure, it's hard to know these kinds of things about yourself. Sometimes it's hard to know why you're interested in things. Self-knowledge is somehow inherently opaque, right? So I don't want to suppose that I really know the answer to this question or there's any certainty, but when I think back to my university years, I think back to taking classes with Richard Dean Winfield. It was really his classes that motivated me to study German idealism. One had the sense that when he was teaching, that what I was listening to was not Richard Winfield, but I was listening to the truth speaking through Richard Winfield. It was almost as though the teacher was effacing himself, and through that self-effacement was allowing, in a way, the absolute to speak through him. And this was he was very charismatic and very systematic. And the inspiration for this mode of teaching was Hegel. He's one of the, he's a respected Hegel scholar. He advised my dissertation on German idealism. And of course, my study of German idealism then informed my understanding of what philosophy is, which I've just articulated in response to your first question. So yeah, my interest in German idealism, yeah, might go back really to a charismatic teacher. I very well could have been studying something completely different. But I suppose I have this deep concern about the relationship of the human being to the absolute. And I'm deeply concerned about how to understand that relation. And I think that German idealism attempts to clarify what that relationship is. And so I find myself continuing to think about it and to write about it and to read about it.
Okay, please let me translate it, Dr. Moss.
Yes.
Jadi ini menarik lagi teman-teman. Jadi kenapa beliau tertarik sama classical German philosophy? Alasannya salah satunya justru karena beliau kenal salah seorang dosen yang ngajar dia, dan ketika dosen tersebut mengajar beliau, itu seakan-akan yang absolut itu sendiri lah. Nanti kita akan ngomongin absolut itu apa. Yang berbicara kepada Dr. Moss. Jadi itu sangat menggugah dia dan seakan-akan kebenaran itu lagi ngomong sama beliau. Jadi itu yang buat beliau tertarik sama pembahasan daripada classical German philosophy. Nah, apa itu absolut, apa itu objektif, nanti kita akan diskusikan di pertanyaan berikutnya. Okay, thank you Dr. Moss. It's really interesting, and actually the reason why I have my interest in analytic philosophy and philosophy as a unit is also caused by my lecturer, my lecturer who really, it's really insightful for me every time he lecturing to me.
Yeah, I think it's very common. It's very common. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll go to the third questions. Yeah, you have mentioned some technical terms like the absolute, the universal. So let's go deep into the classical German philosophy, and maybe you could later explain to us what is it, absolute, universal, etc. So, what is classical German philosophy, and why is it called as a German idealism? And maybe you could share its characteristic and also its historical ideas.
Yeah, thanks. So this is a very good question, and in principle, it deserves a lot more words, and than we have time for. So I'll say I'll try to keep my answer relatively brief and try to pack in as much insight as I can. So I think if we're going to trace the origin of classical German philosophy and German idealism, we need to begin with Kant. So the classic three German idealists, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, they're really trying to fulfill or to perfect Kant's project. So I think what we need to do is we need to understand what Kant was doing. Fichte, for example, will describe himself, or he described himself as a Kantian, even though he has his own system that diverges from Kant in important ways. He still described himself as a Kantian. And Fichte himself was really important for Schelling and Hegel. So I think we have to start with Kant and his critique of pure reason in the late 18th century. So I just want to say something brief about Kant's critique of pure reason, and in particular his transcendental idealism. And then I want to briefly contrast that with Hegel's absolute idealism. So I want to talk about two kinds of idealism: Kant's transcendental idealism and Hegel's absolute idealism. And then we can use those to compare with other forms of so-called idealism. So Kant famously said that David Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, right? So we can think about Kant's project as beginning with this question about experience. What is it that makes experience possible? So this is, what is it that makes experience possible? And Immanuel Kant points out that we can really only have empirical knowledge that's based on experience, if the particulars that we experience are given to consciousness. And so the question is, what is it that makes possible the givenness of particulars to consciousness, things for us to experience? And Kant points out that what needs to be the case is these particulars need to be combined into one awareness. The particulars that we experience need to be accessible to our awareness. They need to be combined and coordinated into one consciousness. So how is that possible? And Kant argues that ultimately, without a priori concepts that, as he says, exist in the understanding, this faculty of thinking objects, particulars that we experience would not be unified in one awareness. So the very fact that there are particulars there for us to learn from indicates that there's already some principle of order and organization that is combining all of these particulars into one experience. So this is kind of the fundamentals of Kant's theory. It's a transcendental idealism because he's asking, what are the conditions that make it possible for us to have any experience at all, such as the kind that David Hume or John Locke are describing? And of course, Kant has, you have to read the Critique of Pure Reason to actually get the answers to that. So I can't give you the whole Critique of Pure Reason, but basically he says we need concepts. We also need intuitions, he says. I won't go into all the details. We can talk about it more later if you want, or people can follow up and actually read the Critique of Pure Reason. It's a very long and difficult book. But the basic idea is, with Kant's philosophy, we no longer have direct access to things as they are independent of our consciousness, but rather we can only know things insofar as they are filtered by the structures of a consciousness. So these conditions that make experience possible are structures of consciousness that objects that we encounter must conform with. So when I encounter an object, I'm not encountering it independently of the structures of consciousness. I'm encountering the object insofar as it is interpreted by consciousness, or insofar as it is structured by the form of consciousness. So when I know an object, I'm not knowing it independently of me. I'm knowing it insofar as it is structured by my knowing of it. I'm knowing my knowing of it, not knowing it simpliciter. I'm knowing my knowing of it. So Kant uses this transcendental critique to set some limits to the legitimate use of reason. So he makes the argument that concepts, they order and give form to experience. They make our access to particulars in experience possible, but they do not, we cannot legitimately apply our concepts beyond a possible experience. And that, he says, is illegitimate. That's doing problematic metaphysics. So discussions, arguments for God's existence, proofs for freedom, arguments that the soul is immortal, all of these things is a kind of illegitimate use of our reason. So anyway, this is Kant's transcendental philosophy. It's pretty intense stuff, right? Kant's transcendental philosophy is really different from Hegel. And you might wonder how could we conceive of them as belonging to the same tradition? So I just want to say something briefly about Hegel here. For Kant, concepts can only be true if there are particulars that instantiate them. And for Kant, concepts don't themselves generate the particulars in which they're instantiated. So if I have a concept of something, the fact that I have a concept of it isn't enough to know that the concept is true. I need to find particulars that instantiate it. And so we have these two parts. We have the particulars given to awareness, and we have concepts that are instantiated by the particulars. One of the basic projects, again, of Kant is to think about the limits of reason in order to determine what it is that we can and cannot know by means of reason. And this is why it's called a critical philosophy. Kant would contrast his philosophy with so-called dogmatic philosophy. Dogmatic philosophy just inquires into the object of knowing without asking whether reason is able to know the object. It simply just right away goes in and asks about the being. That's dogmatic knowing. Critical knowing asks about the capacity of reason to discover truths about the object. So this critical philosophy is something that the German idealists want to develop and perfect. Now, of course, Kant didn't think his critical philosophy needed to be perfected, but the German idealists have this idea. So Fichte, for example, thought that all knowledge needed to be founded on one basic principle, and he thought that the Kantian philosophy didn't properly ground its claims. And so he was looking for one basic principle to ground all knowledge in. Hegel disagreed with this procedure, and I want to give just a brief argument as to why. So Hegel, I think, was profoundly influenced by Kant's critical philosophy because, again, the critical philosophy is inquiring into reason's capacity to know. So Hegel asks the following question: what is the true philosophical method? What is the true philosophical method by which knowledge can be acquired? In order to figure this out, we need, it seems, to give a reason for the method that we employ. Now, in Fichte's philosophy, he argued that what we need is a foundational principle, an ultimate ground that grounds all knowledge. So in Fichte, we have this distinction between ground and grounded, or foundation and what is founded. And Hegel points out that this distinction problematizes philosophical knowledge in general. So he makes the argument that if I have a method, what justifies the method? I could just stipulate the method and proceed this way, but this would be unjustified. It would just be a stipulation. I could use another method to justify the method that I use, but then I could ask what justifies this method. If I have one method and I use this method to justify another method, this may lead to an infinite regress, right? So either I have an infinite regress or I begin without reason. And Hegel thinks both of these are problematic. So his inference is, and it's a radical one, the inference is that philosophical method should not begin with any presuppositions or assumptions, but should be self-developing and without any presupposition. It's probably one of the more outrageous ideas in his Science of Logic. Philosophy, proper philosophical method should proceed in a self-determining way. Whatever method that we use, the only way that it can be justified is if it justifies itself. So we need some self-justifying method that establishes its own truth on its own. This means that its truth is not indebted to anything other than itself. This would be a relative truth, but the truth has to be established by itself. And this is this concept of absolute truth. A concept that is true in virtue of itself alone, that makes itself true without having to refer to anything beyond itself. Now, this conceptual truth is supposed to ground knowledge. And so Hegel doesn't conceive it as merely tautological. That's an important qualification. It's not supposed to be merely tautological, but actually synthetic, to use Hegel's terms. So anyway, this is actually a strong divergence from Kant's philosophy. The idea that true philosophical knowing employs concepts that establish their own truth on their own. Because Kant's philosophy, his critical philosophy, says concepts don't establish their own truth by themselves. In order to figure out whether a concept is true, you have to go look and see if there are particulars that instantiate it or not. And so Hegel's philosophy is an absolute idealism. This means that the concept establishes its truth by itself. By itself. This is an absolute idealism, rather than Kant's transcendental idealism, which says concepts do not establish their truths all by themselves, but rather the truth of the concept must be discovered in particulars that are given independently of the concept. So this is, I think, the strongest formulation of idealism in the German idealist tradition. And this formulation from Hegel kind of indicates to us a very unique sense of idealism. Idealism can be understood as the view that says that concepts determine themselves to be true. Or that in Aristotle's terms, this is actually very different from Aristotle, but Aristotle's idealism has a similar kind of idea. For Aristotle, the world is moved by the unmoved mover, so all motion is generated by the unmoved mover. But Aristotle says the unmoved mover is thought thinking itself. So for Aristotle, the principle of all motion is thought. So Aristotle really thinks that thought moves the world, right? And really, this is the spirit of Hegel's thinking. Even though we're not talking about movement, we're not talking about physics in Hegel, at least not yet. Hegel thinks that the concept establishes its own truth and therefore establishes the existence of the particulars that instantiates the concepts on its own or on their own. And so it is a different kind of idealism. Usually we think of idealism as saying everything exists in the mind. But this kind of idealism that Hegel's advocating is one where the concepts establish their own truth by themselves. And this is so a unique form of idealism, you could say. It certainly isn't naturalism. You know, it's a far cry from all of that. I hope that made some sense. I know that was a lot, but it's very difficult to have this kind of German idealism 101 because it's really a mess. You know, it's really complicated.
Yeah, but it's really blew my mind. Please let me translate it. I really love.
Good luck.
Ya, jadi teman-teman ini menarik banget ya. Memang pertama-tama yang namanya idealisme Jerman itu berangkat dari Immanuel Kant. Ya, jadi bisa dibilang ya filsafat Jerman idealisme itu adalah usaha untuk memajukan filsafat daripada Immanuel Kant. Gitu. Dan Kant ini kalau kalian tahu itu disadarkan sama tulisan-tulisan David Hume. Jadi David Hume ini punya keraguan bahwa kita mungkin untuk mempersepsi kausalitas, ya sebab akibat nggak bisa, terus juga nggak bisa yang namanya diri itu tidak ada dan segala macam. Nah, kan itu mengubah konsep yang dipikirkan Hume itu ke yang namanya idealisme transendental, gitu ya. Jadi kita itu atau manusia itu memahami dunia eksternal dikarenakan adanya yang a priori udah di dalam diri kita, gitu. Nah itu Immanuel Kant. Tapi nanti dilanjutin sama Fiche dan Hegel. Fichte itu, Fichte tadi jujur saya kurang nangkep ya. Jadi saya nggak bisa jelasin nih. Cuma kalau ada teman yang di chat bisa lebih jelasin, oke. Nah kalau misalnya Hegel itu punya aspek yang lebih ekstrim, jauh banget gitu ya. Jadi Hegel ini percaya bahwa bukan bahwa yang namanya yang absolut itu adalah yang namanya idealisme dari Hegel itu percaya bahwa ya segala dunia ini adalah manifestasi daripada yang universal. Nah ya itu, yang segala dunia ini adalah manifestasi daripada yang universal. Sama kayak Aristotle. Jadi semangatnya sama lah. Aristoteles kan juga percaya bahwa ada yang namanya the unmoved mover. Nah the unmoved mover ini adalah apa yang dibayangkan sama Hegel, tapi bentukannya nggak seperti Aristotle. Jadi bukan moving gitu ya. Belum kata si Dr. Moss ini. Jadi kurang lebih begitu ya. Wah, ini daging banget ya. Saya rasa kalian pasti mabuk gitu ya, karena saya juga mabuk. Oke. Thank you, Dr. Moss. It's really blew our mind, but it's really fun. Also, okay, I want to, it's really long and I don't think I have any response. I want to continue my questions. Do you think there is any philosopher whose ideas are the most compelling for you in German idealism, and it really maybe interests you in a scholarly way?
Yeah, thanks. So there are two philosophers that I'm most interested in right now, and that's Schelling and Hegel. And I'm working on a book on Schelling and Ernst Cassirer. Schelling and Hegel are the two philosophers right now that I'm finding most compelling, and maybe I'll say something about why that is the case. So one of the big problems of German idealism concerns the relationship of the infinite to the finite, or infinitude to finitude. And I just want to spend a minute talking about this problem, because sometimes it's hard to find a common thread throughout all these thinkers, actually. But one thing that they all have in common is they all seem to have a similar problem. At least starting from Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel all have a similar problem. And I'll just kind of read one of the formulations of the problem. One of the formulations is, this is from Hegel's The Science of Logic. He says, "The essence of philosophy has often been located by those already adept in the things of thought in the task of answering the question, how does the infinite go forth out of itself and come to finitude?" So how does the infinite go forth out of itself and come to finitude? Fichte asked this question in a letter to Reinhold in 1795. Schelling asked this question in his philosophical letters in the late 18th century. So you have, maybe I'll read a passage from Schelling that also asks this question. He says, "I believe the very transition from the non-finite to the finite is the problem of all philosophy." So why is that? Why are Schelling and Hegel concerned with the transition from the infinite to the finite? Why is that even a problem? What even motivates that problem? It seems very far from a lot of the philosophical questions that we're engaged with, right? But I think part of the reason is we have to think about how the German idealists are interested in absolute knowing and absolute being. And the absolute is what is all-encompassing. You can think of it as absolute generality. So what includes everything, right? And so the absolute, insofar as it includes everything, you could say absolute totality, is infinite. There's nothing outside of it limiting it. And the Germans are asking here, like, is it possible for us to conceptually grasp this infinite absolute? And actually, on the traditional understanding of concepts, it actually seems impossible to do this. Because if we think about the way that concepts are traditionally understood, we usually understand concepts as principles of unity and universality. So for example, if I know what an animal is, I know what each animal has in common. But knowing what an animal is doesn't tell me what differentiates particular kinds of animals from one another. If I want to know that, I have to appeal to another category, other than the category of being an animal. So usually we think of universals, whether we think of them as genera, sets, or abstractions, as some kind of principle of unity, not as principles that differentiate the particulars that fall under them, as in the case of, say, the animal, as I just mentioned. So when we apply this understanding of concepts to the absolutely general, what is most general, what I'm calling the absolute, or totality, if you prefer that term, we run into a problem. Take, for example, the concept of being. This is a concept that Hegel says is one definition of the absolute that we get from his Science of Logic. When I say that everything has being, or anything that is, if I say X is or Y is, I'm not distinguishing X from Y. I'm saying each of them is. So I have an identity, but I'm not saying what makes X X and what makes Y Y. I'm saying each of them is. And so what I'm failing to do is I'm failing to differentiate one from the other. So the fact that everything is, or that everything falls in this big class of being, doesn't tell me what differentiates things from one another. What is it that makes difference between things possible? And the German idealists have a big problem. I cannot appeal to being to explain why difference exists. I have to appeal to a category beyond being, outside of being. But there's nothing outside of being. Only nothingness is outside of being. So there's nothing in the category of nothing that I could appeal to differentiate being. So the idealists have this problem. Being cannot differentiate what is, and nothing cannot either. And so they have this question, given the infinitude of being, how is it even possible for there to be differences and differentiations in the world? And that's a question Schelling asked, that's a question Hegel asked, and in his own way, in his own language, Fichte also asked that question. Now, Hegel says you can never answer that question if you're committed to a traditional understanding of concepts. So he says, Hegel basically says that we have to rethink concepts and the structure of logic itself from the ground up. We have to think of concepts as self-differentiating, as self-particularizing. And traditionally, we don't think of concepts like this. And this actually requires us to think of concepts as not only non-empirical, but as really radically other than even the way that Kant thought of them. On the other hand, Schelling says it's impossible to answer this question. How does the infinite become finite? How can we in principle account for finitude? Schelling thinks that's not something ultimately philosophy can answer. He says it's actually one of the most fundamental mistakes of philosophy to think that you can answer it. So I'll just read something Schelling says. He says, the mistake of all philosophy is to assume that absolute identity, or here the infinite, has actually stepped beyond itself and to attempt to make intelligible how this emergence occurs. So Schelling thinks that it's actually impossible to really conceptually articulate why something exists in contrast to something else. If you begin from being, you're never going to get to something that's differentiated. So Schelling and Hegel have this dispute. Both of them think that this is a problem. How is it that we get finitude from infinitude? How do we get difference from identity? But they disagree about the answer to the question. So this is, I'm really interested in exploring each of their responses to the question. So if we were to think about German idealism as a school, which is very difficult because each thinker has his very own unique way of thinking, I think it's better to think about the thinkers in terms of the question that they're asking. And at least we can see here one kind of common thread running through the whole tradition. The last thing that I'll say about this, about Schelling and Hegel here, is both of them have this idea, arguably a kind of anthropocentric idea about the absolute, that if the absolute is really going to be absolute, if it's going to be all-encompassing, it cannot exist outside of human knowledge. And in other words, it needs to be known by human beings. If it's not known, then the problem is that the absolute excludes something. It's not really absolute. If it doesn't exist in human knowing, then it's relative to something else. It's relative to human knowing. It's excluded by human knowing. So the only way for the absolute to be absolute, according to Hegel, is if the absolute is known by human beings. And this is this idea Hegel has of world spirit, Weltgeist, philosophy as world spirit, which is, what is world spirit? It's a complicated story. But the idea is that the absolute is known by us. We are the beings through whom the absolute knows itself. So for Hegel, the absolute is known, not outside of the absolute, not outside the world, but the world is known from within the world. We are the way the world knows itself. I think Carl Sagan said something like this on the TV show Cosmos. He says, we are the way we are the way that nature knows itself. The German idealists would replace nature with, say, being or the absolute or the infinite. We are the way that the absolute knows itself. We are the way that the world, to simplify it, knows itself. So that's a mouthful. But both Schelling and Hegel have this developmental notion of the absolute, that the absolute is developing, it's determining itself, and it's known by means of human knowledge. And it becomes fully absolute through human knowing. But they really disagree about how to respond to this fundamental question about how the infinite is making itself finite. How is it doing that? And they have really a bitter disagreement. They're really good friends. They're working together in Jena. And then Hegel publishes this Phenomenology of Spirit, 1807, and really gives a really harsh critique of Schelling, and the friendship's over. And, I think Hegel tried to make amends, but it really didn't work. So yeah.
That's really interesting. Okay, so the big questions that Hegel and Fichte trying to ask is, how come the infinite come as definite or understood as definite?
Yes.
Am I right?
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. One question that may be often, I think it's often thought that the absolute is the same with God. What do you think about it?
Right.
Is it right to say that the absolute is God?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there is this theological dimension to a lot of Schelling and Hegel's thought. And sometimes Hegel will refer to the absolute as God, but sometimes he'll use secular language. So Hegel actually thinks that philosophy is, he does think of religion as one form of world spirit. It's one way that the world knows itself. But for Hegel, religion is a way of knowing the absolute in pictures. So like, think about Christianity, right? We have this picture of God becoming a person and then dying and being resurrected. He says this is all very pictorial. It's not thoroughgoingly conceptual. So for Hegel, who I think has a kind of Christian-centric view, admittedly, philosophy is somehow secularizing and conceptualizing what religion understands in a pictorial way. There's something similar going on in Schelling, but I'll just leave it, speak about Hegel now. I think it's fine to speak about the absolute as God in Hegel. I think that's fine. I'm comfortable with it. Some people prefer not to use those terms interchangeably because they're uncomfortable with the religious language. But Hegel does it. I'm not worried about it. It doesn't bother me. But I think we just have to be careful, because for Hegel, God has a mind, but really God only has a mind because we have minds. It's kind of a weird idea. The world knows itself. There is this absolute knowledge about the world, but it happens through our knowledge. It happens through our knowing, through our cognition. So it's not as though it seems God is knowing the world independently of our activity. So this concept of God is more like a philosopher's God. I mean, it's a very, it's heterodox in, if you took, this kind of standard monotheism, kind of on probably any conception of Orthodox Christianity, it's heterodox. But I think one can get along just fine not using the word God, especially if it makes people uncomfortable. Yeah.
Maybe like the way Pascal explained about the God of the philosopher, maybe.
Yeah, it's probably closer to this, but yeah, I think that the term God works, but it's certainly Hegel has rethought what the concept involves. Yeah, there is this world mind, this mind that somehow knows the world, but it's a knowing of the world that happens through us. It doesn't seem to happen independently of the human relationship to the absolute. So this is arguably why it's kind of a zoological notion of the absolute. Like it's arguably it has the human being somehow right in the middle of things here. One of the curious things that happens with German idealism is that they want to complete Kant's project. They want to complete Kant's critical philosophy. But what happens is that they end up engaging in arguably a really speculative metaphysics as a result. So, Kant said that we couldn't apply our concepts beyond a possible experience to entities that may or may not exist beyond a possible experience. But what you end up with in Hegel is a theory of concepts in which concepts are self-realizing and self-particularizing. That's exactly what Kant says you shouldn't do. That's exactly what Kant says is bad metaphysics. So what you end up with, this attempt to radicalize and perfect Kant's project, ends up turning it on its head, turns up actually inverting Kant's whole project. So this is some kind of irony here, some kind of ironic relationship they have to the master.
Okay, please let me translate it first. Very brief.
Okay.
Yeah. Ya, jadi ini daging banget ya teman-teman. Tapi saya nggak bisa nyampein semuanya, gitu ya, karena tadi panjang banget ya. Tapi intinya pertanyaan terbesar daripada Fichte sama Hegel itu adalah bagaimana yang infinite atau yang tidak terbatas itu bisa menjadi dipahami sebagai yang terbatas, gitu ya. Atau gimana dari yang absolut ya itu bisa sampai kepada kita ya, human being atau manusia biasa. Gitu loh. Hegel dan Fichte punya jawaban yang berbeda. Fichte bilang tadi kayaknya nggak bisa dijawab ya, pertanyaan itu nggak mungkin dijawab sama filsafat. Tapi buat Hegel yang namanya yang absolut itu bisa dipahami lewat roh zaman atau zeitgeist. Nah, zeitgeist ini apa? Tadi itu udah lain cerita lagi, kalau dijelasin bakal panjang lagi. Tapi anyway, kita ambil contoh tadi ya, kayak saya nanya nih, oke, apakah kita bisa sebut yang absolut sebagai Tuhan? Di dalam konteks Hegel bisa banget sebut yang absolut sebagai Tuhan. Jadi agama itu adalah salah satu cara daripada adalah salah satu manifestasi daripada bagaimana yang absolut itu bisa dinyatakan kepada manusia gitu. Nah, kalau Kristenan kan itu ada Tuhan yang absolut, yang infinite, itu bisa turun menjadi manusia dan semacam. Nah gitu. Jadi itu kayaknya ya. Terus tadi anyway pada akhirnya, tapi yang menarik tadi ya, Hegel ini kayak inverting ya, kayak Hegel ini kayak membalikkan si Kant itu sendiri gitu. Jadi nggak sesuai sama apa yang diinginkan sama si Kant itu sendiri. Oke. Okay. So okay. Please let me continue to the next questions. I think it's really clear for me. I think it's regarding. Okay, so we talk about the big questions that Fichte and Hegel try to ask, and how they have different answers about how the infinite come to as the finite. So are there any contemporary philosophical ideas or philosophers who are influenced by German idealism?
Right. So yeah, thanks for the question. And let me note that not all scholars of German idealism agree with my representation of German idealism that I just provided. So I want to note that what I've given is a deeply metaphysical reading of German idealism, which you can find in my book, Hegel's Foundation for Metaphysics. I draw a lot on Holgate, and I draw a lot from Brady Bowman and Richard Winfield and others who also have this more deeply metaphysical reading of the German idealist tradition. One of the debates in the scholarship today is, one of the recent debates, I think, initiated by Pippin, was whether we should read Hegel as a metaphysician or not. And there's a kind of deflationary reading that tries to read Hegel either not as a metaphysician, as someone who's not doing metaphysics, who's doing logic or epistemology, or someone whose metaphysics is somehow deflated. Whereas the understanding that I just gave you is the most inflated, the most speculative metaphysics you could possibly have. So I'm really on the complete other side of things here. But let me talk about a couple contemporary people. Let me talk about some living thinkers, right, who are working and living now. So one, Marcus Gabriel at the University of Bonn, is someone who is really coming from a Schellingian background. And he has a very good book, Transcendental Ontology, which I would recommend that everybody read if you want to get a very accessible understanding of Schelling and Hegel and their relation to Kant. Is a very good book. Marcus Gabriel has this theory that the world does not exist. And in particular, we can see his connection to Schelling if we read his philosophical letters. So I want to read something that Schelling says. Schelling says, the main task of philosophy consists in solving the problem of the existence of the world. And so basically that's Marcus's idea, is that the main task of philosophy is solving the problem of the existence of the world. Marcus, of course, says the world doesn't exist. Schelling and Hegel say that it does exist. It's infinite, and the question is, how does it become finite? But Marcus would say that's not even a problem because the world doesn't exist. There's nothing absolutely infinite to become finite, right? So He's actually a very interesting person who's kind of working from out of the idealist tradition. I'm really interested in Grand Priest's dialethism and ideas of paraconsistent logic, because Hegel has this idea that, at least as I read Hegel, that there can be true contradictions. That when we try to articulate the absolute, we end up contradicting ourselves. And Hegel's logic of self-development is such that what you have is you have particular contradictions that arise and that produce specific results. So on Hegel's logic, logical contradictions don't blow up into everything and nothing. Contradictions produce specific results. So it's something close to a paraconsistent logic, but Hegel's logic is not formal. It's not a formal logic, right? It's not a mathematical logic. So there's that difference with a priest. But priest will, you know, in some of his books proclaim that Hegel was right. There are true contradictions, you know. So we have these kind of declarations from analytic philosophers that Hegel is right. It's a very strange era that we live in, right? We have a very kind of a very diversified field of inquiry now. It's which I think is a good thing. So there's Priest, there's Gabriel. There's also a whole host of other analytic and continental thinkers like Robert Brandom, John McDowell, Zizek, who are all drawing from Schelling and Hegel. And there's a lot we could say about all of their systems. I haven't spent equal time with all of them, but I would encourage people, if you're interested in the way that German idealism is alive today, I would say whether it's Schelling or Hegel, there's a lot of living thinkers, very well-known and visible thinkers in both analytic and continental, so-called continental circles that are really creatively developing ideas out of that tradition. There's also in the practical domain, right? So there's Axel Honneth and Charles Taylor, right? So Axel Honneth's idea of mutual recognition, which he gets from Hegel's early Jena lectures. So it's not just in the domain of like theoretical philosophy, but also practical philosophy too. So I hope that kind of gives you some sense of maybe some contemporary realizations of the way that it's alive today.
I remember Marcus Gabriel books, The World Doesn't Exist, which has the unicorn on its cover. Yeah, am I right?
Yeah, I translated that book into English.
Yeah,
exactly.
There's the book in English. I even found it in some bookstore here in Indonesia.
Oh, perfect. Good. Yeah. It's that book was written for the public, actually. So it's a public philosophy book. The version for the more academically minded, or maybe for the professional philosopher, is Fields of Sense. So if you're interested, you can buy Fields of Sense, which is basically the more academic version of the same book.
I'll consider to buy Marcus Gabriel's book.
Yeah.
So last questions from me, but I'll take one or two questions from the audiences. So do you have any tips for someone who wants to start to learn classical German philosophy? Any recommendations to read?
Yeah, there's so much that you can read. There's really too much. I mean, it's probably best just to read the primary text. You know, I mean, really hard, but and it's probably best to read them with a commentary that can help you as you go along. Let me just give some examples. So there's a new translation of Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, or the foundation of the entire Wissenschaftslehre from 1794-95 by Daniel Brazil. I think it just came out this year, or it's just coming out now. And he has a very nice introduction to the text. So I think that's a very good, book to read if you're interested in Fichte. There's also a Schelling reader that just came out with Bloomsbury, and this edited by Daniel Whistler and Benjamin Berger. And it has a lot of primary text by Schelling and some discussions of the ideas. So the Schelling reader is very nice because it collects a bunch of different texts, puts them together. And then there is, I would say, of course, when it comes to Hegel, you have new translations of both Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and his Science of Logic, one by Terry Pinkard, one by Giovanni. And there's a lot of great secondary literature out there. I'll just name some people that I like. When it comes to Schelling, I think Sean McGrath and Jason Wirth are very good. Anthony Bruno. If you read German, there's Philipp Schwab, Christoph Binkelmann, and Christoph Asmuth. If you don't read German, I don't know that a lot of their work is in English. Hegel scholars that I really like are Holgate and Bowman and Richard Winfield. Also, William Maker has a really nice book, Hegel's, the title now is not coming to me. Philosophy Without Foundations, I think, is the name of the title of the book. But you can look at William Maker. It's a very good book on phenomenology, and Hegel as a foundation-free thinker, a presuppositionalist thinker. So yeah, there's a lot out there. Richard Winfield has some nice commentaries on, very nice commentaries on phenomenology, spirit. So I would, if you can take a class in the field at a university or audit one, I think it's probably best to read these commentators along with it, because it's just really dense. They're notoriously bad writers, right? So they're notoriously, well, maybe I shouldn't say bad writers, but they're really hard. They're really hard to read. So
yeah. Unfortunately, I think classical German philosophy is not. There's not so much thinker in Indonesia who really understands classical German philosophy.
I see.
So it was really great to have you here. Maybe there are one or two people who really deals in classical German philosophy, but not so much. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Even one of our lecturers say that he always struggling to understand Fiche and Schelling. One of our. Yeah. But it really is great. Thank you, Dr. Moss. I think I want to take one or two questions from the audiences.
Yeah, sure.
I think there are some good questions. Bung Dama ada mau tanya langsung nggak? Silakan kalau mau boleh buka mic aja kalau memang bisa. Oke, Adik, kita kasih buka mic ya. So, Bung Dama bersedia?
I see some problems in the chat.
Yeah.
Some are in English, so I can read some of them. But please host or moderate as you see fit. I can see some.
The contemporary interpretations of Hegel vary so much in both Atlantic and continental schools of thought, as forwarded by Brandom, Pippin, Holgate, Pinkalzizek, etc. Can you give a quick breakdown of each giver from each other fundamentally? Maybe a really brief and quick. Also, if you have time to answer, do you have any thoughts on Adorno's notion of negative dialectics?
Thanks for the question. Okay, yeah. I can say something briefly about some of these interpretations, but I don't think I have time to talk about all of them. So I'll just mention a couple. So I think there is one of these debates that I already mentioned about whether Hegel is a metaphysician or whether he should be read as a metaphysician. So you'll have people like Pippin who will downplay the metaphysics. In his recent book, he does say that he reads Hegel as a metaphysician, but just not a dogmatic one, basically. He has a lot of qualifications, but he says he's basically misunderstood. He's been misunderstood. And Holgate, I think, takes up a metaphysical reading, as does Bowman, even though Bowman wasn't mentioned in the list there. So there is this debate going on. James Crimes is also another one of these important figures in the conversation about whether to read Hegel metaphysically or not. So in my own book, I talk about Hegel's foundation-free metaphysics. So the title tells you where I stand on this issue, that he has a very strong metaphysical, a very strong metaphysics. Actually, one of my critiques of Pippin actually is that Pippin doesn't discuss the ontological argument very much in his most recent book on Hegel. And Hegel actually endorses the ontological argument in his Science of Logic. He revises it and rethinks it, but he actually gives us a revised version of the ontological argument. This idea that the concept of God entails the existence of God. And this is another way of saying that the concept particularizes itself. It is responsible for its own truth on its own. So I do try to kind of engage with Pippin's thinking as well as Holgate's here. So that's one of the contrasts that's relevant and important here. Brandom argues that, well, as far as I can tell from the reading, I think that there's a number of problems in Brandom's reading. I think Brandom's really fascinating for what he does with Hegel, this creative appropriation of what Hegel's doing. But the reading of Hegel itself is problematic at certain points. He doesn't discuss dialectics. He doesn't seem to think that there are true contradictions. He doesn't focus on the concept of absolute determination. There's a lot of things missing, I think, from his account. But I think he's more concerned with using Hegel in a really creative way than he is with kind of getting it right textually. But I don't want to speak for him here. So that's something. That's something that I should probably stop now. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. But... maybe one last question. It's okay, Dr. Moss?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Another from Dhamma. From Dhamma, Mr. Moss, what do you think about the interpretation of Hegel as a Spinozist?
Yeah, so actually, I would say that on the one hand, I don't like it at all. And on the other hand, I really like it. So let me explain to you why I think it's a good idea and a very bad idea. So I think actually Schelling explicitly says in his freedom essay, the inquiry into the essence of human freedom, that the demand for philosophy, or that the philosophical demand in Schelling's time, is to dynamize Spinoza, is to make Spinoza's God, his absolute, his universe, into a living and free absolute. So Schelling's absolute it's deterministic. There's no freedom in it, or at least there's no free will. Schelling wants to somehow make Spinoza living, make Spinoza free and dynamic. And so Schelling explicitly says that's what we need to do. So actually, it's, I think, much clearer that Schelling is explicitly drawing on Spinoza, affirms Spinoza, tries to, in a certain way, make Spinoza's God dynamic and living. And that's explicit in the text. One of the reasons I'm less inclined to think of Hegel as a Spinozist is that what you have in Spinoza are these attributes. You have the one substance, and you have these attributes like extension and thought. And Spinoza never deduces the attributes from the substance itself. The attributes are just posited. They're not deduced from the substance itself. And Hegel thinks that one reason Spinoza can't do that is really because he has a traditional notion of concepts whereby we can't get difference out of identity. And so I think he's deeply critical of that element of Spinoza. On the other hand, there's a Spinozistic dimension whereby the absolute is arguably the world itself, and the world knows itself by means of human beings. And that's a deeply Spinozistic idea. And that the freedom and the autonomy of the human being in part consists in the fact that we are the way that the absolute knows itself. Or as Meister Eckhart would say, the eye by which I see God is the eye by which God sees me. And in a certain way, the German idealists are, they're picking up on this idea and radicalizing it. So for the same reason someone could read Hegel as a Spinozist, you could also read Hegel as re-enlivening the mysticism of Meister Eckhart or Jakob Böhme. I won't get into that now, but there's a really good book by Glenn McGee on Hegel and the Hermetic tradition that tries to uncover the importance and background of thinkers like Jakob Böhme for Hegel. But I think that there is something to this idea that Hegel has a lot in common with Spinoza. But certainly he's trying to dynamize, to make living what in Spinoza is dead and unfree. Maybe if I want to put it polemically and a bit poetically. So that's a yes and no. Yes. I don't know if that's very helpful, but thanks for the questions. Yeah, very good question.
Yeah, thank you for the answer. Maybe I want to ask one last question.
Sure, okay.
Fun questions, but I think also it's a bit serious. Do you have any German idealism for dummies? Like any recommendations? Someone
Yeah.
said, I mean, like the introduction.
This is really hard. I actually don't. I have
Okay.
actually. This is part of the difficulty, actually, that in thinking about an introduction to German Idealism 101, in a certain way, it's that, it's that kind of tradition where it's hard to actually read it unless you've studied the Greeks, unless you've studied modern philosophy, unless you studied Kant. And then once you've worked your way through all this, then you can get to the German idealists. But if you haven't read Kant and Aristotle and the early moderns, you probably shouldn't read the German idealists.
Yeah. There are so many philosophers.
I mean, I don't want to be discouraging, but someone like Hegel, for example, the whole system is actually his system of logic and his system of nature and spirit. They're really, what he does is he takes the history of philosophy and he organizes it into a system. So the whole history of philosophy is somehow, at least the most important moments as Hegel sees it, are integrated into the whole system. So as you study the system, you're studying the history of Western philosophy. Let me qualify that, very important. History of Western philosophy, right? So much is actually left out, obviously. Asian philosophy and so many traditions are just left out. But it's really hard to teach Hegel, I found, in an undergraduate setting at university. So I've taught German idealism in the university for seniors, for juniors and seniors, but it works even better for graduate students who already have a bachelor's in philosophy. So it's like trying to jump in to study quantum mechanics before you've studied Newton, or trying to study relativity before you study Newton. It's really not something you can do well, I think. I don't need to be discouraging, but I want to encourage people to explore it, to investigate it. But I think it's actually it's very and it really requires a lot of preparation, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll do some digging and try to find something and then send you an email. And if I find something that's helpful, a kind of German idealism for dummies, I will totally send it your way. You've really sparked my interest. Some genius out there has written this book. Some genius out there has done it. So I'm sure it's out there, but it's certainly not me. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, thank you, Dr. Moss. But it is really helpful. At least it really encouraged us to start to understand what is classical.
Yeah. Thanks for inviting me and inviting me to talk about these crazy philosophers and some of their crazy ideas. I'm sorry that we don't have more time, and I know that it was a lot packed into a very short hour. So I hope that some of it made it through, and that there wasn't too much nomenclature or like overly technical language in the presentation. Although this is always kind of difficult. Yeah, it was nice to meet you guys, and nice to learn about your group. And I'll certainly follow you on Twitter, and let other people know about this really excellent organization. So
yeah, thanks a lot, Dr. Moss. It's really great to have you here. Yeah, so there, you have anything to say?
go ahead.
Okay. No, enough. Thank you.
Oh, no,
thank you,
no,
Dr. Moss.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you for translating, Samuel. I hope that's a tough job, translating. That's a very tough job.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's some habituations from many other philosophers before you. Yeah, it's tough.
Excellent.
Once again, I'm really grateful for you here. So yeah, I hope the audiences also can get something out of this.
Excellent.
Jadi
So,
begitu, teman-teman.
is this recording available on YouTube, or is it available? Yeah. It is. Okay.
We'll upload it in YouTube. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Great. Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank
you so much,
you,
Dr. Moss.
Dr. Moss.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.